I vividly remember a moment when I woke up one day and realized I couldn't move. Not emotionally, but physically. My entire body felt like a heavy boulder, and no matter how hard I tried to live life normally, I felt paralyzed. Months before this moment, I had been diagnosed with a severe Epstein-Barr infection that decimated my body. I had never felt this miserable and sick in my entire life. My lymph nodes in my neck and under my arms were swollen, my thymus gland in my chest hurt, my thyroid was inflamed, and my spleen was swollen and in pain. All of my immune organs were suffering. It took me many months of treatment and rest to finally start to feel somewhat normal and symptom-free again. But then, just as my physical symptoms were healing, I was hit with a profound bone-deep paralysis. I'd lie in bed or on the couch for hours, unable to move, unable to think, unable to act. I remember thinking at the time, I've never felt like this in my entire life. But that wasn't entirely true. The truth that I couldn't access at the time was that I had felt like that before when I was a small child enduring an unthinkable trauma. What I didn't know at the time was that this paralysis wasn't random. It was a profound trigger, and one of the reasons why at the time I didn't know it was a trigger was because it didn't feel like your usual emotional trigger. It wasn't irritation, emotional reactivity, or even emotional overwhelm. It was so much deeper than how we generally define triggers. And that's why I'm shooting this video. You'll learn the spiritual and somatic truth behind what a trigger actually is, the 3 levels of triggers from surface level to deep soul level triggers that can paralyze your life, and how to finally heal each level so you can move forward again. Because here's the thing, most people only know how to work with surface level triggers. If you don't understand the deeper ones like what I experience, your life can feel like it's permanently on hold. And here's the empowering truth. Once you understand these deeper levels, you stop being controlled by your triggers and you start transforming them. First, let's start with some of the more mainstream definitions of triggers in psychology. Triggers are external events or circumstances that may produce very uncomfortable emotional or psychiatric symptoms such as anxiety, panic, despair, or negative self-talk. Or, an emotional trigger is any topic that makes us feel uncomfortable. These emotional triggers are telling us which aspect of our life we might feel frustrated or unsatisfied with. In these definitions, we can already see some of the common characteristics of what a trigger is. It's anything that can cause a rapid and intense emotional reaction in you. But then, if we go deeper and into more embodied and grounded psychology, like in the work of trauma expert and best-selling author of the trauma classic, Waking the Tiger, Dr. Peter Levine, he sees triggers in a really interesting way. He says that trauma is an incomplete survival response, either fight, flight, or freeze, and a trigger is a reactivation of that incomplete survival response. Here's what he means. All right, so I call this a survival loop. And in wild animals, the survival loop looks like this. You start out and the animal is calm. Then the loop continues. There's some kind of stress. When the stress happens, there is a response from the animal. So it's either going to be, the stress is maybe an animal starts chasing you and the animal responds with, I'm going to run or I'm going to fight. So there's some kind of response that's defensive. I mean, it's either going to run away, I'm going to fight it, or I'm going to freeze. So the body chooses a response. When that response takes place, let's say the animal runs away, and then if they survive, the danger is over, and once the danger is over, the animal does something called a discharge of energy. So they discharge energy. Once they discharge energy, they go right back to their calm state. So this discharging of energy, this is usually when an animal shakes or when they lick themselves or when they walk it off slowly after a stress is gone and they have survived. Shaking is actually really common. You'll see animals in the wild shaking a lot after they've gone through a stress. But then once they discharge that energy, they return to calmness. With humans, though, things are a little bit different. So with humans, the loop starts the same. You have calm, then there's some kind of stress, The body chooses some kind of response. So it's literally the same up until here. It's the same as wild animals. Calm, there's a stress that presents itself. The body and the nervous system responds to that stress, either fight, flight, freeze. And then here's what happens. The loop gets stuck here because there is no discharge of energy. This happens frequently with humans. When this happens, this is what Peter Levine calls an incomplete loop. Okay? This is an incomplete loop or incomplete response. All right? And so when this happens, the loop never actually closes. There is no discharging of energy. And so what happens is, because there's no discharging of energy, no processing of the energy, it gets stuck in a person's body and it gets repressed. This loop never actually closes, which means that the person never goes from the response to calm. They stay in a nervous system response that is a response of stress. So when you experience trauma, your body has an enormous amount of unprocessed energy that's stored, and the trigger reactivates that energy in an attempt to complete the loop. That's why I use this mantra with my clients all the time when I train them to work with triggers. I say that triggers are your best friends, because they're bringing you into contact with deep wounds that have not been healed yet. From a spiritual perspective, a trigger means that the energy of the original wound has been reactivated and is being broadcast throughout your body, and this can feel overwhelming at times. Imagine a very still lake or pond, and then you drop a rock into the water. As soon as the rock hits the water, the movement ripples in all directions. That's how I see a trigger. It activates a core trauma or wound, and the wound ripples its energy outward all through your body. I used to see a trigger more like a protection mechanism that kept us away from the original wound, because often that's how it feels. When you're triggered, you can be so emotionally activated that it can be hard to think or act in a way that heals the original wound. Triggers can sometimes distract you from healing the wound, especially when you don't know how to work with them. We can get so caught up in the unprocessed energy that's moving through our bodies that we can't remain present enough to engage with the original wound, let alone heal it. This is why most of the time when people are triggered, they just point fingers to the outside situation or say that it was someone else's fault for triggering them. They simply feel overwhelmed and react outward, never taking the time to recognize that the trigger is simply a reactivation of a past trauma that has not yet been healed. But over the years, especially as I became a more trauma-informed and trained coach, my understanding of triggers has shifted. I now see them more like a door that opens up and takes you back to the moment the wound was created. A trigger takes us into a part of us that is in desperate need of love and healing. If you're currently struggling to work with triggers or the traumas that cause the triggers, I invite you to coach with me inside my private community, Heart Alchemy. In Heart Alchemy, we don't accept the idea that people should only cope with triggers or trauma. We successfully work on truly healing them so our members feel empowered to live their lives fully. As my client Irina shared, before Heart Alchemy, I was coping with trauma, but now I'm finally healing trauma. And this isn't a one-off testimonial. When we surveyed our members and asked them about what the top benefits they had experienced in Heart Alchemy, the top choice was healing my past by overcoming core wounds and blocks. To learn more about Heart Alchemy, go over to my Instagram with the handle The Heart Alchemist and DM me the word Heart26. We'll talk about how Heart Alchemy can completely change your life. Here's what most experts miss. A trigger isn't just one thing. There are actually levels or depths to triggers, and each level needs a different response. This is why people so often miss the opportunity to heal deep wounds, finally release the energy, and complete the loop of trauma, because they often try to cope with triggers, I hate that word, in only one way, when in fact there are multiple ways to work with triggers depending on what level you're at. The first level is what I call activation. This is a pretty light trigger. In this instance, the trigger is light enough that you feel like you can stay present with the trigger. You don't feel emotionally overwhelmed by it. It doesn't completely consume you. This trigger is much easier. This is the easiest one to deal with, and you very rarely would lose your sense of presence in this trigger. So you can feel uncomfortable, you could feel a slight emotional ting or a twinge, but you don't lose control or you don't come completely out of presence. This level is usually when, let's imagine someone says something to you that feels a bit offensive or that feels a little bit off. And you feel that trigger coming on, but you are able to stay present and work through it, even though you feel slightly triggered. Then comes level 2. This is what I call deep activation. This is a more profound trigger. In this instance, you can feel an enormous emotional pull, almost to the point where you feel overwhelmed. You can lose your sense of presence with this trigger. This is often that type of trigger where people lash out at the source of the trigger. So you can become really emotionally reactive. You can react to the person that's triggered you. You're so emotionally activated that it's very difficult for you to regulate. This can take many minutes to hours for you to be able to regulate yourself when you're in this type of level 2 activation. Another little interesting thing about a level 2 deep activation trigger is that this is often that trigger that if you don't know how to work with it, you end up saying things that you could regret later. So if you've ever been in a situation where you've been triggered and just something comes out of your mouth in a reactive, overwhelmed, emotionally explosive way that you then 2 or 3 hours later regret that you did that, that's because you were in a level 2 trigger. It's much harder to regulate this trigger. And the operating word here for level 2 is overwhelm, emotional overwhelm. You feel like your emotions are taking you over. Then comes level 3, and this is what I call a core activation. This is the trigger that I described in the beginning of this video. This is what happened to me. The core activation is such a profound trigger that it behaves very differently from the other two. So in this case, in a core activation, a level 3 trigger, you are so triggered that you actually go beyond overwhelm and into a place of complete freeze and shutdown of the system. So much so that you actually may not even know you are triggered because this trigger does not behave like this one. These two triggers, you know you're triggered because of the emotional reaction, the emotional response you feel inside of your body. This one is very different. You may in fact be so shut down that you are completely disconnected from your emotions, and so it could take a while for you to even notice that you are in a level 3 trigger. This trigger can take a long time to resolve itself or for you to regulate yourself. It can take, anywhere from hours to days, weeks, or months, depending on how far you go in this level 3. And the reason you can go this long in a level 3 is because your emotional system is shut down. You are completely disconnected. You can be disconnected from your body and from your emotions. So you have no way of accurately and quickly telling you if you are even triggered or not. The reason why I went into a level 3 trigger when I got sick was because I have a lot of trauma related to my physical health. My entire childhood was clouded by my father's illness, and I spent my entire childhood trying to keep him alive. I was a very spiritually attuned and sensitive soul who, for whatever reason, thought that it was my responsibility to keep my dad alive. He had many close calls with death when I was growing up, and I felt a deep despair because I knew inside of me that he would die a young man, which is exactly what happened when I turned 18. He died at the age of 50, and by then, my entire childhood had revolved around sickness, hospitals, and death. So when I got sick, that activated an immediate level 3 trigger that left me paralyzed on my bed. Here's an easy mathematical way to see what determines the trigger level. Earthed. So it starts with the severity of the original wound. So the more severe the original trauma, this is the first original wound where that main trauma occurred. And then when you add the perception of severity, this is how your nervous system perceives the trigger to be similar to the original wound. So if your nervous system perceives the trigger to be similar to the wound, that's going to increase the trigger level. Now remember that the operating word here is the word perception, meaning that the trigger, the situation that is triggering you, can be totally different from the original wound. It doesn't have to be the same situation, but your nervous system perceives it to be similar. It feels the trigger to be similar to the original wound. And when it does that, your trigger levels are going to be high, right? So this is the equation that'll help you understand this, how severe a trigger is and at what level it is. It has to do with the severity of the original trauma, how much your nervous system perceives the trigger to be similar to the trauma. That's going to give you a trigger level. So in my situation, I had a pretty severe original trauma. And then when I got sick, my nervous system perceived that sickness to be very similar to the sickness and the childhood illness stuff that I had been traumatized by. And because my nervous system perceived a huge similarity, that gave me a level 3 trigger immediately. This simple equation will come in handy in a bit when we talk about how to work with triggers. Let's start with the level 1 activation. This one is the easiest to resolve because it's a pretty light trigger, which means that either the severity of the original wound was small or the perceived similarity with the wound was also small. With this trigger, the process is pretty simple. I feel the trigger, I pause and take a deep breath, I acknowledge the emotion or the emotions that I'm feeling, then I engage the trigger with curiosity, not judgment. Here, I like to journal and ask, what was this trigger about? You want to see if you can spot what the original wound is. For example, let's say I go to coffee with a friend and that person comments on something related to my body and I get activated. It may be because as a child, my body was criticized by my family or I got called names in school. You want to always try to work backwards from the trigger to the original wound. When you finish journaling or engaging with the trigger, now you discharge energy. I like to use body shaking or pounding my feet on the ground as a way to discharge energy like wild animals do. This is the way you teach your body to close the survival loop we talked about earlier in this video. Now we move into level 2 trigger, a deep activation. With this level of trigger, I can be so emotionally reactive that it can feel almost overwhelming and hard to regulate. So the procedure has to be different than in level 1. I pause and take a deep breath, but here, when I take a deep breath, I'm not just calming my nervous system, I'm also using the breath to make my chest cavity bigger. Spiritually, I'm increasing the size of my container so that the emotions don't feel as overwhelming. Then, immediately anchor in your body, and I like to do this by putting my hand on my heart because that's an easy way to connect with your body through touch, and it feels very calming to do this. It's also a great idea to step away or pause the interaction if I'm triggered by a person and the person is still present. So I can say, I need a few minutes to regulate and I'll come back to the conversation again. If you have someone you trust and who is calm, you can co-regulate with them too, but you can also regulate alone and create a sense of safety within yourself. When you feel regulated, go deeper and take out your journal to answer some questions. What's the feeling? What are the emotions? Why did that trigger me? What's the deeper wound that trigger was showing me? When you finish your journaling and working through the trigger, then it's time to discharge energy in the same way we do for a level 1, either shaking or pounding your feet for a minute. And now you're ready to close the survival loop. And I love doing this with a prayer or a healing statement. It can be something like, I am safe and ready to heal this wound in all directions of time. Now let's go into a level 3, a core activation. This one is the hardest trigger to work with by far, and it's because of this feature. You may not even know you're triggered at first. And why is that? Because this trigger doesn't feel emotionally charged like the other levels. Here, your body goes into a freeze response and you completely dissociate from any feelings. This trigger might feel rare, but it's not. This is actually one of the most common trigger levels for people who have childhood trauma because as children, we don't have the availability to use fight or flight. Fight or flight response is only available when someone can actually run away or they can fight their threat. Children can't do this. So the fight or flight response is generally not available to children. So if you have childhood trauma, the likelihood that you used fight or flight was pretty rare. This is the freeze response, shutting down your system, is one of the most common protection mechanisms of people who go through childhood trauma. When we're small children, we can't run away or fight whoever is harming us, especially if that harm or trauma is coming from people who raise us. In my case, the trigger was so deep and unconscious that I stayed paralyzed, I think for weeks, until I finally was like, what's wrong with me? That's why the procedure for working with this level is to always start with curiosity, meaning you have to learn to do self-check-ins whenever you feel off. And by off, I mean when you feel disconnected, out of your body, numb, or even depressed. This is eventually what I did when I was at this level of trigger. I remember one day closing my eyes and thinking, what am I feeling? That's when I caught that I was in freeze. And from there, I started asking deeper questions. Once you become aware of your level 3 trigger, now you must create safety. This is the absolute ding ding moment because you can't come out of freeze unless you feel safe. So here, you want to co-regulate with someone you trust, or if you want to regulate yourself, try a micro-regulation hack like orienting to the objects in the room. So you're going to look around slowly and calmly. Use your breath to slowly anchor you in your body, or use physical touch, slowly squeezing your arms and legs to show your body that you are safe. Then comes another fundamental step that is different from the procedure with the other trigger levels. You're going to move your body slowly, starting with small movements first. Maybe slowly move your hand while you're looking at it, then move your hips or start dancing very slowly and consciously. The reason you're using a slow movement is because a level 3 trigger does not respond well to faster stimulating movements. If you've ever seen an animal in the wild come out of a freeze response, like you'll see an animal will freeze and they will stay frozen until the threat dissipates. And then once the threat goes away, the animal will start moving. You'll never see the animal get up quickly and sprint away. They'll get up slowly. They'll start to move really slowly. That's how the body naturally comes out of freeze, which is why a rapid, fast moving, a lot of stimuli can actually keep you locked into freeze. So you want to start moving slowly. This is absolutely crucial to come out of a freeze response. I like to think of the image of coming out of freeze almost like you're frozen. So let's say you were freezing in the freezer and then you came out of the freezer. You're thawing yourself slowly before you can move. That's the metaphor that I use for coming out of a deep freeze response. You're thawing out your body slowly, and so the movements have to be very slow and conscious. While you move your body slowly, add some soothing affirmations to help your body come out of freeze. It could be something like, I am safe to heal. My body is safe to reawaken. Once you feel your body is coming out of freeze, and here's a little pro tip, you know it is because you'll start feeling something. When you start to come out of a level 3 trigger, now it's time to go deeper. And the good news here is that I find this trigger level the easiest to understand because for you to be triggered to this level means your nervous system perceived there was a huge similarity between the trigger and the original wound. So that means you don't have to fish a lot to uncover the original wound because a level 3 trigger will be telling you that the trigger is similar to what the original wound was in the first place. So you don't have to fish for this one. So for me, this was easy because I knew right away that the trigger was showing me the childhood trauma around sickness and death. Once the light bulb went off in my mind, I knew right away that the trauma still needed healing. So I asked deeper journaling questions like, what still needs to heal about this trauma? What am I not seeing about this wound? Once I do my journaling work, now it's time to close the loop, and I love doing this with a sacred ceremony. This means I light some candles, start drumming and calling on spirit and all my guides, and I set the intention to heal the core wound fully while asking for spirit's assistance. An important note about a level 3 trigger is that it takes time to resolve. This may not happen quickly like the other triggers because of the nature and complexity of the freeze response. For me, it took a couple of weeks for my body to fully come out of freeze. That's how deeply triggered I was, and that has to be okay. You're not in a rush, you're very compassionate with yourself and your beautiful body as it slowly comes out of this trigger, and in the process helps you heal a core original wound. Watch this video next if you want to go deeper and learn more about exactly what a freeze response is and the practices and tips to help you get out of it.